And joining us now on the debate in the nation's capital, John Manley, President and CEO of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, that's him on the left of your screen, and Ian Lee, professor at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University. And back here in studio, Tom Clausen, President and CEO of the Ontario Hospital Association, Hugh McKenzie, economist and principal with Hugh McKenzie and Associates, and we welcome back the Globe and Mail's Lisa Priest. Good to have everybody on our program today for a discussion that is rather topical. Now, Lisa, let me just get you to kind of briefly recap some of what we just talked about insofar as we are in a new world where there are new freedom of information rules. What do we know specifically about hospital CEOs' salaries now that we wouldn't have known before the new rules came into place?
We knew the general numbers, so it's always been a little bit of course, of contention about how much CEOs make and are they making too much. What we know now, which we never knew before, at least with 85% of the hospitals that have put them on their websites, are some of the perks that they were allowed before the government recently clamped down on them. So things like cosmetic surgery, golf club memberships, expensive other gym memberships, luxury car vehicles, those kinds of things we're now finding out about that we didn't know about before. Okay, let's go to Tom Clausen now. And one of the ways that we are going to hopefully have an intelligent discussion about all this is to first of all find out what hospital CEOs actually do. What's the job?
Well, the job is really about leadership, and we have hospitals that are $5 million operations, $5 million a year. We have hospitals that are almost $2 billion a year in terms of operating budget. So the job is quite different in terms of leadership. So in the very large hospitals, besides delivering care over multiple sites, there's a big responsibility for development of major research programs. So for example, the biggest hospital, UHN, is doing research of about $300 million a year. And also teaching many students, many residents, many international fellows. And there's also a big responsibility related to foundations. Although foundations are separate legal entities, most of the hospitals have more than one foundation now because of mergers that took place in the past. So it's the leadership to try and set the direction of the organization and then supporting the physicians, nurses, and other staff to be able to perform these various missions.
And Ian Lee, would you say that, let's pick up on the University Health Network situation. If you're running a $1.75 billion university health network, is that similar in terms of the management skills you need, in terms of what you actually do on the job, to running a $1.75 billion private sector company?
No, I don't think it's exactly similar. Certainly there are overlaps and there are similar responsibilities, but in the private sector, the role, there's a fundamental distinction between the public sector and the private sector. In the private sector, your goal, your objective is to maximize profits, maximize revenues, maximize shareholder wealth. That's perfectly legitimate. It's capitalism 101. In the public sector, it's completely different. The role of the deputy minister or the head is not to maximize the market share of Transport Canada, for example. It is to produce public policy to maximize the public good. In other words, they are there to serve the greater public good. And so we're getting into almost philosophical differences, existential differences between the public sector and the private sector. And that's why I think that salary comparisons between the two, or attempts to produce salary comparisons, fall down.
Okay, let's follow up with the gentleman sitting beside you. John Manley, you were asked by the Ontario Hospital Association to lead an investigation into executive compensation at hospitals across Ontario. Couple of parts in this question. First of all, what did you learn about how executive compensation at the hospitals is actually set?
Well, we found that depending on which group of hospitals, Mr. Clausen's described what a variety there are, it could be quite different. In the smallest of the hospitals in Ontario, you could find that the CEO compensation basically followed a track that paralleled the size of the hospital that was determined according to its total budget. At the top end, the biggest hospitals, you found that they were all clustered around the same basic level of compensation, even if they were a few hundred million apart in terms of their total size. In the middle, it was all over the place, and it was very hard to find particularly any rhyme or reason to who was paid what or why.
So did you come away from that experience of looking at how compensation was set and say to yourself, this is screwy, this doesn't work?
Well, certainly we recognize that it was pretty difficult to figure out how you arrive at a number. We tried a variety of comparisons. We compared to others in the public sector, universities being an obvious case in point. There are a few other Crown entities in Ontario that are large and that parallel hospitals in terms of the size of budget being managed. As Ian said, the objectives in a lot of these cases are quite different, and so it's not a perfect comparison. We did compare with compensation in the private sector based on a survey of numbers and found that, generally speaking, hospital executives were paid quite a bit less than their counterparts in the private sector when you compared total budget in the hospital to total revenues in the private sector. On average, when you just looked at cash compensation, didn't consider the long-term compensation that private sector executives would get, you'd find that on average they were somewhere around the 25th percentile if you make that comparison.
Okay, Hugh Mackenzie, now I'm going to bring you into this to sort of, we're going to cover a few bases here. We've heard what we now know that we didn't know before. We've heard how compensation is set. We've heard that public versus private sector, there are differences. We've heard the vast range of responsibilities that hospital CEOs have. Having heard all of what you've now heard, do hospital CEOs in Ontario make a fair wage?
Well, I'm going to take as my point of departure Ian's existential question, because I think the fundamental issue is, where do you go for the comparatives? What's the basis for comparison? If you take as the basis for comparison the private sector, even the private healthcare sector in the United States, the conclusion that you would come to is that Canadian hospital executives are underpaid. If you take it as your frame of reference, the public sector, I think your conclusion would have to be that they're very well paid.
When you say very well, do you mean overpaid?
It's not. I don't think it's really for me to judge that. Because I think one of the things that we have to get away from is this idea that there's kind of a gigantic job evaluation that goes on, and that there's some rationality across the economy in how people are paid per unit of value that they add to the organization. That's not the way it works. It's a market. There's a negotiation that goes on between the individual and the board that appoints them, and it's a balance of power and fear that goes on there. If you have a strong board and a relatively weak negotiator as a CEO, you may end up getting away with paying less. On the other hand, if the fear quotient runs the other way, you may end up paying more. Right. But I think the point I would make, though, is that none of the hospital CEOs would in Ontario would come close to making the bottom of my list of 100 best paid CEOs on the TSL.
I was just going to bring that up, because you did look at the 100 top paid CEOs.
Yeah, and the lowest paid of those made $3.2 million.
So there's no hospital CEO on that list at all?
Not even close. Not even close.
So Ian Lee, this is not necessarily a question our viewers might have thought would be emerging from this program, but are hospital CEOs, given their responsibilities and given the size of some of the ventures that they operate, are they underpaid?
I like the comments that were just put forward. It really depends on who we compare hospital CEOs to. Are we going to compare them to the private sector? Are we going to compare them to the public sector? I do not believe that they should be compared to the private sector, because they are in the public sector. Yeah. If we compare them, for example, to deputy ministers in the government of Canada, Canada is the 8th or 9th largest economy in the world. Very important country, and the federal government is in charge of the entire country. Deputy ministers who are at the very top, very, very top of their departments, Deputy Minister of Finance, Deputy Minister of Health Canada, are making between $200,000 and $350,000. And I would suggest, and with no disrespect at all to the CEOs of hospitals, I think that being the Deputy Minister of Finance, managing the totality of Canada's economy with all of the variables, and being in the fishbowl of Ottawa where you're being scrutinized every second, is far more challenging and far more complex than a CEO in a hospital making perhaps double or triple what a deputy minister is making in the government of Canada. So if we use that as the benchmark, as our comparator, then hospital CEOs are in fact overpaid.
Well, you're saying one of two things. Either the Deputy Minister of Finance is drastically underpaid, or the person running the University Health Network is dramatically overpaid. Which one are you saying?
Indeed, but well, this has been studied. There's starting in the 80s, actually in the 90s, in the government that Mr. Manley was associated with, they implemented a series of reviews, of systematic reviews. It's now called the Stevenson Report, and they're up to their, I believe, their 15th or 16th report, where they have dealt with this question, and they've said, well, we're going to compare public sector and private sector, but they lean much more to the public sector, and they have over the years come up with the frame, the salary range for deputy ministers that I've just put on the table. So I'm accepting that as the gold standard, if you will, because it is the government of Canada. It is the overarching government responsible for the totality of the country and not a single province. And so I'm accepting their studies, their frequent studies, systematic studies that they have gone through over 14 or 15 years as a legitimate empirical analysis of executive compensation in the public sector.
Okay, Hugh's got to follow up.
Yeah, I just want to, again, to come in behind on this question of whether it's public sector or private sector. I think one of the complications in this whole exercise is, particularly over the last 15 years, there's been a real schizophrenia on the part of government about how heads of agencies that deliver services for the government should be operating. We've heard a lot of speeches about how public sector agencies have to behave more like the private sector. And so there's this kind of sectoral ambivalence. On the other side of the coin, a few years ago, the provincial government decided to consolidate the budgets of the hospitals into the provincial budget, not have them operate for budgetary purposes completely outside. And that means that at least notionally anyway, the CEOs of these hospitals report to the Deputy Minister of Health.
Tom, a follow-up for you?
Well, first of all, I don't agree they report to the Deputy Minister of Health, and I'll say that a Deputy Minister of Health is not a CEO. They're a Chief Operating Officer. The Minister is the CEO, and I think that's clear for any deputy that works at the provincial level or the federal level. But I would come at this entirely differently. I think you've got to look at this from the perspective of adding value. If you can get a CEO that you can spend $1 million on and they save you $10 million, that's a pretty good return on investment. And if you look at the situation in Ontario, which is the only province that has voluntary governance at the local level, we have 150 boards at local level. That's the only province. We have CEOs for each of those hospitals. We have the most efficient hospital system in Canada. We run our hospitals at 20% less cost per capita in Ontario than they do in the rest of the country. We have the best wait times in the country. We have most of the top research institutions, hospital institutions in the country. So we got a high-performing health system in Ontario, and I would suggest that the effective leadership of the CEOs that are in these jobs is proven by the value that they're creating.
Okay, but I would say yes, but we're in the middle of some very difficult economic times. Lisa, your newspapers covered this quite extensively. What would happen? You've heard the provincial New Democrats say that no hospital CEO should make more than twice what the Premier of Ontario makes, so capping the salary at somewhere over $400,000 a year. If you did that, what would happen?
I think 2/3 of them are already below that level, if I'm not mistaken, and then there's a few that are above it, some going as, I think, as high as about $700,000. I think some of the issue is that some of these CEOs are physicians, and so as clinicians, they could build a public health care system more if they went into it. There's a lot of talent in that pool, and there's 150 hospitals all looking for the same people, so there's competition, narrow talent pool, and given these uncertain economic times, you are going to need really clever, really out-of-the-box thinking for future leaders. So while I can see, maybe having a salary freeze, I think sort of capping it is not going to be like, they're not going to get the desired savings they want, and it's not going to dramatically add anything to the healthcare system anyway.
Let me get John Manley on that as well, because obviously you're the only one around this literal and metaphorical table who's actually been elected and had to deal with these issues in that respect. There is a temptation for the electorate to say, they do this job for half the money, why are we paying them so bloody much of our money? So if you did cap salaries, in your judgment, what would happen?
Well, and by the way, I can't resist pointing out that the ministers are generally paid less than the deputy minister, but, I wouldn't want to quibble about that. We looked, of course, when we were doing this work at the fact that that the idea of capping had come into the political debate, and a couple of things. First of all, we very much felt that that wasn't going to be the solution to Ontario's deficit problem. Is just too small a number to make any difference at all. Secondly, that we weren't asked by the government to do this. Had they asked us, they might have asked us to look at the overall governance of Ontario hospitals, which is really, it's unique. It made it difficult for us to make cross-provincial comparisons. But in Ontario, you have, every hospital has its own independent board. The board appoints the CEO, the board decides on the pay package. Well, we didn't find there was a lot of likelihood of CEOs leaving the hospital sector to go to other sectors. We did find that within their team, particularly the chief financial officer and the chief human resource officer, could move easily into the private sector or into other segments of the public sector. So you have a bit of a limit there, because you clearly can't be paying your CEO less than you're paying your CFO or your chief human resources officer. So there's a bit of a pressure to prevent you from going down too far. What does the public think? Steve, I was in elected office for 16 years. You can always gin up some of the public to say that anybody in the public sector, whether they're bureaucrats or whether they're politicians, is paid too much and doesn't work hard enough. I think if we go down that road, we tend to get the kind of government that we deserve. I think that both politicians and politicians as well, on behalf of public sector workers, have to be prepared to say we need to pay a fair wage, because people are making all the time choices of career, and if we want to attract some of the best and brightest, some will do it just out of a sense of public service, and I think there needs to be an element of public service, but some will make very practical, pragmatic choices on the basis of compensation. So if we're way out of the ballpark, then we're just not going to attract the kind of people and the quality of people that we need in these important roles.
That's the thing I wanted to follow up with Ian about right beside you, and that is that are we saying that if we don't pay for their gym memberships, or we don't pay for their memberships at certain rather exclusive clubs, or we don't give them, $600,000–700,000 a year, they're going to go run some HMO in the United States? Is that really the case?
I'm glad this has finally come onto the table explicitly. There's an implicit assumption that people in the public sector are motivated primarily by the same monetary considerations as the private sector. I don't think that's the case. I worked in banking for 10 years before I quit to go back to graduate school, because I wanted to become a professor, and I knew the professors made less than bankers, but it was much more important for me. And a case in point, I saw a very recent interview with former President Clinton, and he was reminiscing about his time as president, and he said, well, I've made millions of dollars since, but he says it doesn't even come close to comparing to being impactful. The point being that you enter the public service not for the money. You go into the public service, whether you're a hospital administrator or a professor or a public servant, a bureaucrat, because you want to make a difference, because you want to be impactful, because you want to educate the next generation. There's a whole range of non-monetary motivations that motivate people to.
Whoops. Well, obviously we've got a technical problem there. We'll try to get relatched with Ottawa and come back. But it does raise this question. We're in an economic time right now, Tom Clausen, where the people who are making the $500,000 and $600,000 and $700,000 a year salaries, those salaries are being paid by people who make $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year. Do they not have a right to find out what they're getting for their money and, maybe be a little envious that these guys are making this kind of dough?
Well, they totally have a right to know what they're getting for their money. And the Ontario Hospital Association, on behalf of hospitals, asked the government to put in freedom of information legislation in 2009, which led to us then suggesting that hospitals post their contracts on their websites, their executive contracts, before they're even asked to be seen under the legislation, which kicked in on January the 1st. And the contracts, of course, include everything. And the bulk of what people make is their salary. Lisa made reference to cosmetic surgery. I just can't let that pass. I mean, there was one contract that actually suggested out of a health benefits account that they could use it for cosmetic surgery, although the person said they never did. I haven't seen them, so I'm not sure. But
do you want to name names? Who was it? We'll let you know.
I can assure you of all the contracts we've looked at that that would be the only one that had that sort of suggestion in it. I think overall the bulk of what people make is the basic salary and pay for performance. These kinds of things like car allowances, et cetera, which over time have been fairly common in executive contracts, are probably things that upset people and probably have a less value to the individual than they have to the person complaining about the fact that they're receiving them.
Is that part of the problem here? The optics of getting, you know, gym memberships and cars and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think, but I want to pick up on one of the points that Tom made kind of obliquely. One of the things that this controversy over the details of the benefit plan and the details of the car allowance highlights is the dramatic difference between the level of accountability and disclosure that's expected of people who work in the public sector and organizations that operate in the public sector and organizations that operate in the private sector. The level of the accounting standard that public agencies are required to report to, the extent of the disclosure, is just light years more rigorous and more extensive than it is in the private sector. And so it does tend to create sitting ducks out of people who lead public sector agencies and out of those agencies themselves.
So should those again, those extras, whatever you want to call them, those little extra benefits that get so much attention in the newspapers, should they be disallowed?
Well, I think smart people, the next time they negotiate their contracts, won't negotiate for those things. I mean, some of these things are artifacts, right? Some of these things are left over from the days when some of these benefits weren't subject to tax, right? For example, back in the old days, you could get a car, and the tax cost of the car was lower than it would have been if you'd gotten the money. A lot of those things have changed. They're just kind of artifacts. And if I was advising a CEO of a hospital negotiating a contract, I'd say keep it simple.
Keep it simple. John Manley, do you think it's appropriate for the boards of various hospitals to say, look, you're wonderful, you deserve us to pay your gym membership, you deserve a nice car, but we can't stand how that looks optically, and I'm sorry, we're just not going to do it. Is that okay to do?
Well, our panel took the view that you could pay these things if you wanted to, as long as you disclose them publicly, and I think that the daylight itself would rein in some practices that would be seen as offensive. I think that the comment that these are artifacts of a time when they were not taxable is quite accurate. Right now, most of those benefits are fully taxable anyway, so you know, what the heck? Why have them pay your gym membership? Why don't they just give you the $100 a month or whatever it's going to be, and you pay it yourself, or you get fat and keep it in your pocket, whatever you choose to do. It just doesn't make a difference anymore. Our view was from the study that we did that the broad level of perks that were paid to hospital CEOs was not out of range on average in terms of what their total compensation was. It wasn't offensive, it wasn't egregious. However, the public, because it's public money, should know what it is and what it's for, and I think that would rein in a lot of those practices.
Lisa, let me follow up with this. When you're in the private sector running a big corporation, you know, there are targets that you can hit to see whether or not you're deserving of your salary. The share price goes to whatever, your revenues are whatever, you've sold so many units of whatever. Do they have those kinds of targets in a hospital that would make the board at the end of the year say, okay, Mr. or Mrs. CEO, you hit your targets, therefore you deserve that salary?
Yes, a lot of the big hospitals do. The at-risk pay varies in hospitals between 2% and 30%. But
what is that, sorry?
What they call at-risk pay. There's a chunk of money that's sort of held, and if you don't meet your performance targets, you don't get the money. So some hospitals, as little as 2%, some hospitals make it as little as 2% of the income, others 30%, but it really gets a CEO focused on what do I need to do, how do I get it done? And I think that's sort of the more important part. I mean, these perks, I mean, they're small numbers and they've done more damage than anything, and who knows if they've even negotiated some of these strange sounding ones. But the performance benchmarks, if we're going to have standards that doctors and nurses have to adhere to, why don't we have standards on how we determine compensation and run a hospital?
But one of the real challenges there is that it's hard work for boards, right? Because if you actually are going to make a serious attempt to evaluate the performance of a CEO in areas that are relevant to the hospital's objectives, to pick a hospital as an example, that's hard work. Somebody's actually got to sit down and figure out what those measures are. You've got to have the tough conversation with the CEO about what the plans are for the year, and then the board or the compensation committee or the chair has to devote, I would argue, a lot of time to figuring out whether those targets have been met. And that's why so many, particularly in the private sector, so many of these executive compensation bonus schemes are lazy. We'll pay you if the share price goes up. We'll pay you if the stock options pay off. Because it's just too tough to figure out whether it was your fault that you didn't make the sales projections or something real about the company. It's hard work, and I think that one of the takeaways from this is that we may be having a little trouble managing compensation at the executive level in the hospital sector in Ontario because there are so many.
So many hospitals.
So many hospitals and so many
151.
boards, and some of the boards I think are probably at a pretty serious competitive disadvantage in actually trying to deal with these compensation issues.
Tom, take us sort of behind closed doors a little bit, if you would, here. When boards sit down with prospective CEOs, they don't have share prices that they want CEOs to hit or units going out the door or whatever. How does the conversation go about the specific kinds of targets that a CEO would have to hit in order to get that at-risk pay?
Right, so I've been the CEO of a couple of big hospitals here in Ontario, and actually with the first one, going back into the 1990s, in both cases there's been pay-for-performance schemes in place even before I started working there. So on an annual basis, well, first of all, I should say that both of those organizations, and I would say almost all hospitals now, have strategic plans. So they have clarity around where they're heading. And in the better strategic plans, they actually have performance indicators in the strategic plan as to what performance they hope to achieve over a multi-year period.
So what did you have to hit?
So at a place like UHN, I was being measured on things like, well, one, whether we were balancing our budget or not. Two, how we were doing on certain quality indicators, so certain patient safety indicators. Now we have about 9 patient safety indicators that all hospitals have, and so that could be a really good way of measuring. How we were doing on education in terms of the feedback from the students, how we were doing research and the amount of the number of dollars of research grants that we were able to acquire, and also citation index for the researchers in terms of whether people were citing their work in terms of other work being done. So we had a whole series of indicators, some of them related to construction and finishing projects on time, on budget, that I was held accountable for as the CEO. And as I say, it was about, as Lisa pointed out, initially it was the bigger hospitals, about 30% of the hospitals had this. Last year, the government brought in the Excellent Care for All Act, which required that all hospitals have pay-for-performance schemes, all hospitals have quality improvement plans, and that they actually post what they're holding their CEO and other executives accountable for in terms of getting their performance pay by achieving certain performance targets.
Ian, as I listen to that job description, that sounds a heck of a lot more like a private sector corporation than it does anything to do with medicine, in which case, are the higher salaries justified?
I agree that there is an attempt, and we've seen this across the public sector. We've seen it in the Government of Canada, the Federal Public Service, as well as in the provincial, an attempt to replicate or duplicate market conditions in the public sector, bonus pay, strategic plans, and so forth. However, I think it's artificial. It's artificial because in the final analysis, you do not have that ROIC, the return on invested capital, the famous bottom line. And it may be a bit lazy, as somebody just suggested, but it is nonetheless real. The company can fail. The company can go out of business. And so there is a lot of freight put on, a lot of emphasis put on, did you grow the company? Did you increase the ROIC? And so what we're trying to do is develop these AirSATs measures, because at the end of the day, it is a public hospital. It is a public good. It is funded with public monies from the taxpayer. And so I think that the effort, although it's noble, at the same time, it's profoundly flawed because it is a political process, because it is in the public sector.
Lisa, this pay-for-performance scheme, is that the way to go?
I think it is, certainly. I mean, things like, you know, do people comply with hand hygiene? Is patients' satisfaction up? All these kinds of indicators they collect anyway, and it forces them to focus on areas that are really important to a hospital and to patients.
Tom?
Well, you know, I'll actually say in some ways the private sector is easier, because if you have a product line that isn't profitable, you get out of it. And you try to get out of a product line in a hospital. It was impossible before, it was very unlikely before, but it's impossible now. And so you're constantly looking at how you can still provide that service and provide it in such an efficient way that you can balance your budget. It's a challenging juggling act to actually be able to provide service, give people access to care in a timely manner, have good quality, and balance your budget.
You know, there is, Ian, I remember when Bob Rae was Premier of Ontario, he told a story about how the public sector and the private sector are different. He said, if you know, one of my northern MPPs screws up, boy, do I hear about it, and I got 30 reporters with microphones in my face scrumming me about it, telling me asking me what I'm going to do about it. If the branch manager for X bank has a problem in Sault Ste. Marie, you know, the chairman and CEO of the bank down on Bay Street does not have 30 reporters with microphones in his face saying, what are you going to do about that district manager in Sault Ste. Marie? These are different worlds, right? Do we have to look at them differently as a result?
Well, if I can just jump in on that point, and this is really pointing to the second problem with trying to equate the two, and that's dealing with the austerity that the government of Ontario is going to have to adopt imminently because of the Drummond report. It is, and this is really a political issue I'm raising. It is very, very difficult to go to somebody making $50,000 a year, or $70,000 or $30,000, and say, you know, you've got to carry the burden on this. You've got to put your shoulder to the wheel and really try hard and carry the cost of this deficit reduction. And by the way, we can't really touch or go after people that are hospital CEOs because, well, they're in a competitive market and we might lose them. You know, it's a political argument, and for the McGuinty or any premier to attract the political support to sustain austerity, it's going to have to be across the board, and we can't carve out exceptions and say, well, you know, the people running hospitals, for example, are going to be exempted from this. And we are going to be facing this question, and that's why I wanted to put this larger issue on the table.
No, that's a great point, and maybe can I go to John Manley beside you, since again you've had two hats on this issue. That is a conundrum for any political leader, for any hospital leader to have to deal with. How do they get out of that?
Well, I think treating everybody more or less fairly is key to it. In Ontario, of course, they've done the reverse. They froze hospital executive salaries, but didn't freeze the salaries for those who had collective bargaining arrangements. In some of the smaller hospitals, we found that had actually resulted in bargaining unit employees getting paid up to and sometimes more than executive people in the hospitals. So when you're trying to recruit, say, frontline nurses or others to come into administration, that's a bit of a problem. They don't generally like to take a cut in pay. Some people are willing to do it, as Ian mentioned, but if you're staying in the same sector, generally you don't like to do that. So it hasn't been done across the board till now. I think we get into dangerous territory if we say, well, you know, some people are paid a lot and therefore they can afford it, and other people are not paid a lot and therefore we should go easy on them. The problem that you run into as finance minister when you operate that way is there just aren't enough of those people that are paid a lot to get the results that you're going to need to get. So having been through this in the 1990s, I mean, I wasn't the finance minister, I was the industry minister. I lost half my budget in the 1995 budget, and I lost about 25% of my employees. It was drastic. And I represented a national capital constituency where a lot of my constituents actually worked for the federal government and went through this. At the same time, it wasn't, you know, capping increases at inflation. It was zero increases. So it was tough. but it required a very skilled communicator putting the message across, and it required a perception that everything had been done quite fairly. And I think Ontario is going to face that in the months to come.
Hugh, I wonder if you could pick up on that. How do you, if you're running a government, convince the people who are earning $50,000 a year that they need to pay some people some very large six-figure salaries in order to have the kind of health care that those people making 50 grand a year will need at some point in their lives? It's a tough sell in this economy.
It is, and I'm going to agree with John. I think that a sense of fairness, a perception of fairness in the way these things are done is absolutely critical. And part of it, I realize this takes us a little bit outside of this table.
Go for it. Let's hear where you're going first.
But part of it is looking at the revenue side of the equation as well. Because I think one of the things that really demoralizes the public service is when they see an event taking place like the deterioration of the economy, and so much of the burden of adjusting to that ends up falling on them. So I think that there's a sense of fairness that's required. It's not just within the public service, but it's also more broadly.
I'm going to read between the lines here because you didn't exactly say it right out. You want taxes to be raised on better off people in order to sort of contribute to that aura of fairness that you just referred to. Is that,
absolutely, and I also want to see the need to conserve revenue as one of the priorities as the government's moving into this austerity period. I think it's astonishing that we haven't heard. That we've only heard sort of tentative mumblings about maybe slowing down the rate of corporate tax reduction. I think given the scarcity of revenue right now, I just think it's crazy not to be doing that.
Well, you're right. It's a little off topic, but you know what? We've got a former federal finance minister in Ottawa right now who I think left office with a $9 billion surplus when he stopped being Minister of Finance. So I should ask him, you're right, we've got about 5-6 minutes left in our program here, so why not have some discussion about this? You know, Drummond is going to report raising taxes is not part of his mandate. Looking at raising taxes is not part of his mandate. But insofar as you suggested a moment ago that fairness and the appearance of fairness needs to be there in order for the public to buy in, what do you think about what Hugh McKenzie just had to say and the implications of where that might take us?
Well, again, I think our experience was that you could increase taxes and other fees. In '95, there were some tax increases. There were also a lot of increases in fees charged for various kinds of government services. But if you were doing that, you absolutely had to be crystal clear that those revenues were going to impact the deficit. They were not going to fund new programs or to support some other group or some other interest that was unrelated. People, once they got the message that this was serious, and we were facing a really critical situation. And I think people in Canada now understand that just as well as they did then. They're seeing examples on their television screens, particularly from Europe, that's reinforcing what happens when you let these things get away from you. They'll be okay with it. And I think businesses will be okay if the rate of tax reductions is slowed, provided they're convinced that that's actually going to address the deficit problem and not going to fund some newfangled program.
Tom Clausen?
Well, one of the statistics that strikes me is since 2004, the Health Accord, the nominal GDP in Canada has gone up 4.7% per year on average, but we've been increasing healthcare spending at a rate of closer to 7.5%. And you can't do that forever. You can't just keep growing healthcare. Pretty soon it'll consume a higher and higher and higher rate of our GDP. So I think we should, rather than looking for new revenues, I think we should look at this as an opportunity to figure out how we can provide healthcare in a more efficient way. I look at other countries, particularly Australia and New Zealand, where their cultures are pretty similar to ours. They're providing healthcare, they're getting similar outcomes to what we get. They have much better processes. It doesn't take so long to get access to a family physician or a specialist as it does in this country. And they're doing it at a cost that's about 10 to 15% less on a purchasing power adjusted cost per capita. So I think we've got room here to make the system more efficient. The OHA has lots of ideas on how to do that. And it takes me back to leadership. It's easy to have ideas. You need really good leaders to implement them. Healthcare is really tough because there's whatever you want to implement, somebody's going to criticize it. You need strong leaders, people who can really stand up and make the change.
I should ask Lisa about that. You've met your share of hospital CEOs and leaders within the healthcare sector. Are we well served at the moment?
I think we are. Most of them are visionaries and know how to connect things and know how to make things happen. I think a lot of them are really talented. There is variation in them as well, and I think in the future you're going to be real change managers, people who really know how to shake things up inside a system, because what's been going on in healthcare has been going on too long, and the change is just not moving fast enough.
But Ian Lee, the question you hear asked is, if you are working as a hospital CEO, you are part, in some respects, you are part of the public service. And you know, this whole issue about salaries has raised the question of whether or not the public part of that equation and the service part of that equation have somehow been overrun by what some in the public would perceive as a desire to make big money and have, you know, excellent compensation packages. What's your thoughts on that?
I agree. I mean, I think we're trying to, if you will, straddle. We're saying, well, we'll be a little bit public sector and a little bit private sector, and unless and until we confront two-tier and the possibility of having private hospitals versus public hospitals, just as there are private universities and public universities, where they have two different salary structures, I would point out, by the way, in the United States, in the private versus the public. Until we confront that, we are, I think, misleading ourselves by saying, well, you know, we're going to pretend that they're, or try to structure them like private executives, but by the way, they're running a public hospital with all of the accountability, the public accountability and scrutiny, and the expectations of fairness that people expect from the public sector. And I think that we're going to have to confront that contradiction. And my preferred answer is to say, look, people, you are public servants and you're going to make less money, and some will leave and some won't. There's no problem recruiting deputy ministers in the government of Canada, even though their salaries are well below the private sector, their counterparts in the private sector.
Tom?
Well, I mean, first of all, we want to attract the best people. I mean, it really strikes me that in everything else in society, we say, let's attract the best people. Let's look at the whole of society, the diversity of society, attract the best people to do a job. And here where I'm hearing you say that for public sector jobs, we should only limit ourselves to those people, that subset that's interested in public service. I personally view when you got a $16 billion deficit, which is what this province has, a 15% deficit, you need the best talent you can get to provide leadership to get you out of that hole.
Even if you have to pay them $1 million a year?
Well, I think you look at it as value added. You look at what can they actually do for you in terms of return on your investment.
Okay, we'll give the guy from the Hospital Association the last word on this, in part because he represents hospitals, and in part because, how many more days you got on this job?
3.
Friday the 13th is your last day.
That's right.
There's got to be a good joke there somewhere, but I'll leave it alone. Good of all of you to participate in our discussion tonight. John Manley from the Canadian Council of Chief Executives in Ottawa, Ian Lee from the Sprott School at Carleton University. Thanks to the two of you for being on the line there in the nation's capital. Tom Clausen from the Ontario Hospital Association, Hugh McKenzie from his eponymously named consultancy, and Lisa Priest from the Globe and Mail. Thanks so much, everybody.